Blood was already drying on the hardwood floor when officers stepped into the apartment of 27-year-old Claire Donovan. The television was still on, her dinner sat untouched on the counter, and the front door showed no signs of being forced. Whoever had been inside had left quietly, as if they had never been there at all. In the hours before her death, Claire had spoken with her sister on the phone, promising to meet for brunch the next morning. That call ended at 11:30 that night. By sunrise, she was gone. More than a decade later, detectives remain no closer to finding the person who ended her life. No weapon was ever recovered, no fingerprints could be matched, and the one person who knew what happened inside that apartment has never come forward. This is the unsolved murder that left investigators chasing shadows in the heart of New York. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we bring you the world's most haunting unsolved crimes, where questions linger and justice remains out of reach. Friday, September 9th, 2011. The city's streets pulsed with late summer energy. Bars spilled out onto sidewalks, taxis raced through red lights, and the hum of conversation carried long into the night. For most New Yorkers, it was just another evening. For 27-year-old Claire Donovan, it would be her last. Claire had built a life that seemed full of promise. She worked as an assistant editor for a respected publishing house in Midtown and had recently begun pitching her own ideas for a memoir collection she dreamed of completing. Friends described her as grounded yet ambitious, someone who balanced long hours at the office with dinners, wine nights, and long phone calls with her sister. That evening, Claire joined two friends at a wine bar on the Upper East Side, just a short walk from her apartment. Witnesses later recalled seeing her at a corner table, a glass of red in hand, laughing at something one of her friends had said. She looked relaxed, at ease, blending seamlessly into the Friday night crowd. At 11:45, the group split up. Her friends offered to walk her home, but Claire declined. It was only a few blocks, a route she knew well. Cameras captured her leaving the bar, carrying her small leather bag, her hair tied back. Nothing in her body language suggested fear. Those images would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. At 11:30, just minutes before leaving the bar, Claire had called her sister, Sarah. The two spoke briefly about plans for brunch the next morning. Sarah later said her sister sounded upbeat, tired but happy. There was nothing unusual in her tone, no hint that anything was wrong. By sunrise, Claire never arrived. When Sarah tried to reach her the next morning, the calls went unanswered. By afternoon, she walked to Claire's apartment with a spare key. Inside, she found a scene that would haunt her forever. Claire was lying on the floor of her living room. Her dinner, a simple salad and soup, sat untouched on the counter. The television still flickered in the background. The door showed no signs of forced entry. Police arrived within minutes, securing the scene. Neighbors filled the hallways, whispering in shock, straining to catch details as officers carried evidence bags through the narrow stairwell. For detectives, the lack of forced entry meant one thing: Claire either knew her killer or had been caught off guard by someone who slipped in unnoticed. The brutality of the act contrasted sharply with the ordinary details of her last night. A glass of wine, a phone call with her sister, a short walk home. All of it ended in silence, leaving investigators with a haunting puzzle that would stretch on for years. By the time officers arrived at Claire Donovan's apartment on East 87th Street, the scene was frozen in an eerie stillness. The door stood unlocked. The television still flickered with the low hum of late-night programming, and the faint smell of reheated food lingered in the air. Yet on the hardwood floor, Claire lay lifeless, her final moments written in silence. Her sister, Sarah, had been the one to find her. Shaken and trembling, she told detectives that nothing appeared stolen. Claire's purse sat on the coffee table. Her phone was plugged into the charger by the bed. Even her wallet, complete with credit cards and cash, remained untouched. To investigators, it was clear from the beginning. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Detectives began with the basics. They documented the apartment, photographing every angle, every item left out of place, every mark that could later be explained or challenged. Claire's dinner, half prepared and waiting on the counter, suggested she had returned home from her night out and felt comfortable enough to settle in. There were no signs of a forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered locks. Whoever had stepped inside that apartment had either been invited or had entered so quietly that Claire never had a chance to resist. Neighbors were interviewed immediately. Most reported hearing nothing unusual that night. A handful recalled faint voices near midnight, though no one could say for certain whether it came from Claire's apartment or another floor. One neighbor, a woman across the hall, remembered hearing what she described as a thud shortly after midnight, but admitted she dismissed it at the time, assuming it was someone dropping something heavy. Forensic teams combed through every corner of the unit. Fingerprints were lifted from common surfaces, but all belonged to Claire, her sister, or frequent visitors. Strangely, there were no prints near the front door handle or on the kitchen counter where her bag had been placed. Investigators considered the possibility that her killer wore gloves, a detail that suggested planning rather than impulse. The medical examiner's initial report estimated time of death between 11:45 and 12:30. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, delivered with an object that was never found. There were no defensive wounds, which puzzled investigators. It suggested that Claire had either been caught completely off guard or that she had trusted the person enough to let them close without fear. Media outlets quickly picked up the story. The murder of a young professional woman in one of New York's busiest neighborhoods sparked fear and fascination in equal measure. Reporters gathered outside the apartment building as police carried evidence bags through the entrance. Headlines described Claire as ambitious, bright, and with a future cut short. For her family, the attention was unbearable. Each detail replayed across television screens and newspapers, while answers remained out of reach. Detectives began working through the circle of people closest to Claire. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, and former partners were interviewed one by one. None provided information that directly linked them to the crime. Some expressed shock, others sadness. But the overwhelming question was the same: who would want Claire Donovan dead? Despite the pressure and the resources of the NYPD, the crime scene gave them almost nothing. No weapon, no clear fingerprints, no signs of struggle. The apartment was tidy, almost too tidy, as if someone had carefully avoided leaving a trace. For investigators, this raised a chilling possibility. The killer knew what they were doing. This was not the work of a stranger who panicked. It looked more like someone who had thought about how to enter, how to leave, and how to vanish without being caught. By the end of that first week, detectives faced a grim reality. The case that seemed solvable in those early hours was already slipping into shadows. What should have been a home filled with evidence had become a silent room of questions. And one truth loomed over every detective assigned to Claire's case. Her killer had walked back into the city that night, blending in with millions, carrying a secret no one had yet uncovered. The days after Claire Donovan's death were a blur of interviews, evidence logs, and unanswered questions. The NYPD formed a task force dedicated to the case, pulling in homicide detectives with years of experience in complex investigations. But experience did little to ease the frustration that quickly set in. Detectives began where they always do, with Claire's closest circle. Her family was questioned at length. Sarah recounted the phone call the night before, her voice breaking as she told investigators about their plans for brunch. Their parents, living upstate, were devastated but cooperative, confirming that Claire had not expressed fear or concern in the days leading up to her death. Friends painted a picture of a young woman building her career, someone who enjoyed her independence and had no known enemies. She was cautious but not paranoid, sociable but selective. She had dated a few men in the past, though none were described as serious relationships. Investigators followed each lead, calling in ex-boyfriends for questioning, combing through Claire's phone records and emails for signs of conflict. Nothing suggested an imminent threat. Attention turned to the building itself. Detectives canvassed every floor, knocking on doors, searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. The neighbor across the hall repeated her claim of hearing a thud after midnight, but no other residents corroborated the sound. Surveillance footage from the lobby showed Claire returning home just before midnight. No one else appeared on camera entering or leaving in the critical window of time. This raised a troubling possibility. Had the killer already been inside her apartment before she arrived? Detectives examined the locks, but found no tampering. The theory was unsettling. If someone had gained access earlier, they could have waited for her in silence, hidden in shadows until the moment came. The media frenzy only intensified. Local news stations framed the case as a reminder that even in a city as busy as New York, danger could slip unnoticed through unlocked doors. National outlets picked up the story, portraying Claire as another victim in a city struggling with crime rates that year. Headlines demanded justice, while anchors speculated endlessly about who could be responsible. For detectives, the scrutiny added pressure. Every lead was followed, every phone call checked, every timeline scrutinized. Yet, for all their effort, the case refused to give up its secrets. One potential lead came from a doorman at a building down the block, who reported seeing a man in a dark hoodie lingering near Claire's street around the same time she was last seen alive. He described him as tall, thin, and restless, pacing near the corner before disappearing into the night. Investigators searched for surveillance cameras that might have caught the man, but none provided a clear image. Without more detail, the sighting remained a frustrating what if. The medical examiner's report added little clarity. Claire had been struck with significant force, but the weapon left no distinctive imprint. It could have been anything from a blunt household object to a tool brought from outside. Without recovery of the weapon, the possibilities remained endless. As the first week closed, detectives held a press conference. Standing in front of flashing cameras, they urged anyone with information to come forward. They reassured the public that leads were being pursued, but behind the scenes, frustration grew. Investigators admitted quietly that they were dealing with one of the most perplexing cases of their careers. For Claire's family, the press conference offered little comfort. Sarah stood silently at the edge of the crowd, clutching a photo of her sister. To her, the statements of determination sounded hollow. She wanted answers, not promises. She wanted to know who had stolen her sister's life and why. But the truth was clear even in those early days. The investigation was already stalling. With each hour that passed, the trail grew colder. The city moved forward, and the person who had ended Claire's life walked free, hidden in plain sight. In every homicide investigation, detectives know the truth usually hides close to home. They began with the people who knew Claire Donovan best, working outward in slow, deliberate circles. Each name carried the weight of possibility. Each alibi was tested against the timeline of her final hours. The first to draw attention was an ex-boyfriend named Daniel Reeves. He and Claire had dated for nearly a year, ending the relationship amicably, at least on the surface, 2 months before her death. Friends told detectives that while Claire had moved on, Daniel had not. One recalled overhearing a tense argument outside a coffee shop, with Daniel pleading for another chance. When police tracked him down, Daniel admitted he had been hurt by the breakup, but denied any involvement in Claire's death. He claimed he was at home the night she was killed, playing video games with a roommate who confirmed his story. Investigators checked phone records and found nothing suspicious. For a moment, Daniel seemed like a strong lead. But without physical evidence, suspicion slipped through their fingers. Attention then shifted to her workplace. Claire was an assistant editor at a competitive midtown publishing house, an industry where ambition often bred resentment. One colleague in particular, a junior editor named Melissa, had clashed with Claire over project assignments. According to office chatter, Claire had recently been given an opportunity to lead a high-profile project, one Melissa had openly coveted. Detectives questioned Melissa, but she produced time-stamped security footage from her apartment building in Brooklyn that placed her miles away during the window of the crime. Any professional jealousy she carried wasn't enough to tie her to the murder. Then came the neighbors. Police combed through the building, interviewing every resident. One man on the floor below claimed to have heard muffled voices around midnight, though he couldn't identify them. Another neighbor described seeing a man leaving the building in a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured, though no one else could confirm the sighting. Investigators considered the possibility that the hoodie man, spotted by the doorman earlier, was the same figure. But without a clear image, the lead dissolved. One neighbor, however, drew more interest than others. A middle-aged tenant named Robert Fields, who lived directly across from Claire. Quiet and reclusive, Fields had a history of minor arrests related to disorderly conduct. When questioned, he seemed evasive, claiming he had been asleep the entire night. Detectives pressed him, noting that his account conflicted with a neighbor who claimed to hear him walking in the hallway. A search of his apartment turned up nothing more sinister than stacks of old newspapers and empty beer bottles. Without evidence, suspicion could not transform into proof. As the weeks unfolded, the pressure on investigators intensified. Each suspect seemed to carry just enough reason to warrant scrutiny, but never enough to anchor a charge. Detectives described the process as maddening, like holding water in their hands, watching it seep through their fingers no matter how tightly they tried to contain it. The frustration echoed in the family's voices. Sarah pleaded for answers in interviews, her grief sharpened by the knowledge that people around Claire were being questioned but not arrested. "Somebody knows what happened," she told a reporter, her voice breaking. "Somebody walked into that apartment and ended her life. And they are still out there." For the task force, the circle of suspects seemed less like progress and more like a labyrinth with no exit. Each interview opened new doors of possibility, but every door led to the same dead end. By the end of the first month, the list of suspects had grown long but remained empty of certainty. Ex-lovers, jealous colleagues, uneasy neighbors, all carried shadows of doubt, but none bore the weight of proof. The one truth detectives could not escape was that Claire's killer had been close enough to gain entry to her apartment, close enough to take her life, and clever enough to disappear into the night without leaving a trace. And as fall settled over New York, one reality became clear. Without new evidence, the case of Claire Donovan risked slipping into silence. For the Donovan family, the days after Claire's death blurred into one long nightmare. News cameras lingered outside the apartment building. Reporters asked endless questions, and strangers dissected her life in headlines. But inside the family's home, away from the flashing lights, there was only silence. A daughter was gone. A sister's voice had been cut short mid-conversation. Her parents, Margaret and Thomas Donovan, lived in a quiet town 2 hours north of the city. They had raised their 2 daughters with the usual mixture of love and worry, but had never imagined outliving one of them. Claire's murder shattered more than their daily routines. It fractured their sense of safety and their belief that life followed some predictable order. Margaret later described it as a hole that never closed. a wound invisible to the outside world but always present in their home. Sarah carried a different kind of pain. She was the one who had found Claire's body, and the memory lived in sharp fragments she could not push away. The unlocked door, the stillness of the apartment, the image of her sister lying on the floor, the television humming in the background. She told detectives every detail she could recall, hoping that some small thing she noticed might help. But when the answers failed to come, guilt settled in. "If I had gone sooner," she told a reporter years later, "maybe she would still be alive. Maybe I could have stopped it." The family threw themselves into the investigation, attending every press conference, calling detectives daily, insisting that the case not be pushed aside. Sarah became the public face of their fight for justice, standing in front of cameras with a photo of her sister, pleading for information. Her voice cracked, but her message never changed. Someone out there knows what happened. We need them to come forward. The attention was draining. Reporters dug into Claire's past, publishing articles that speculated about her relationships, her career, even her routines. Some headlines painted her as ambitious, others as vulnerable. For the family, it felt like Claire was being turned into a symbol rather than remembered as the person they loved. Margaret once told a journalist, "They write about her like she is a character in a story. But she was our daughter. She had favorite songs. She hated mushrooms. She loved reading late at night. She was real." Behind closed doors, grief took on heavier shapes. Thomas withdrew, speaking little, pacing the house late at night, as if waiting for answers that never arrived. Margaret clung to Claire's belongings, the books she had left at home, the jacket she had worn the last time she visited. Sarah became restless, unable to sit still, always searching for something new, an article, a theory, a name that might lead them closer to the truth. The holidays that year were especially brutal. An empty chair at the table reminded them of what had been stolen. Gifts remained unopened in closets. Margaret described it later as living in reverse. As if time had stopped the night Claire was killed while the rest of the world kept moving forward. As weeks turned to months, frustration with the investigation grew. Detectives assured the family that the case remained a priority, but the lack of progress was impossible to ignore. Sarah began keeping her own notes, compiling timelines and articles, convinced that somewhere in the details lay the clue that police had missed. The Donovan family's grief became a kind of second investigation, one fueled not by duty, but by love and desperation. They knocked on doors, they wrote letters to officials, they begged for media coverage long after the cameras moved on. Every unanswered call and every unreturned email deepened the sense that they were fighting alone. For the Donovans, the struggle was not only about justice, it was about memory. They refused to let Claire's life be reduced to a case file gathering dust. They fought to keep her story alive, to remind the world that behind every cold case there is a family still waiting, still grieving, still holding on to hope. And even as the years wore on and the silence grew louder, one truth anchored their fight. Justice for Claire was not negotiable. They could not bring her back, but they could refuse to let her be forgotten. The murder of Claire Donovan did not remain a private tragedy for long. New York was a city of millions, yet one young woman's death on East 87th Street sent ripples far beyond her apartment building. The case became a mirror of the fears that lived quietly in every resident, a reminder that danger could wait just beyond the glow of the streetlights. In the weeks that followed, newspapers carried Claire's photo on their front pages. Some showed her smiling at a family gathering, others used the corporate headshot taken by her publishing firm. Beneath each image ran headlines about an ambitious young editor whose life had been cut short. To readers, she became both a symbol of potential lost and a chilling reminder that no neighborhood was safe enough to prevent violence. Neighbors on her block described a shift in atmosphere. The street, once ordinary and calm, took on an edge of suspicion. Residents double-checked their locks at night and avoided walking alone after dark. A woman who lived 2 doors down told reporters that she no longer felt safe taking her dog out late. Parents began escorting their teenage children to and from the subway. Small measures of security became rituals, a collective attempt to reclaim a sense of safety. Local politicians seized on the case, calling for increased patrols and improved building security in residential neighborhoods. At a community board meeting, a council member described Claire's death as a wake-up call, urging residents to remain vigilant and report anything unusual. The NYPD promised extra patrol cars and canvassing, though behind the scenes detectives admitted they had little to go on. Television coverage stretched the narrative even further. National networks framed the story as a reflection of the city's larger struggles with crime. Commentators debated whether Claire's case highlighted flaws in policing or whether it revealed the randomness of violence in urban life. For the Donovan family, these discussions felt like a cruel abstraction. While experts debated theories, their grief was unrelenting and personal. Among young professional women in New York, the case struck an even deeper chord. Social media threads filled with anxious posts. Women shared stories of being followed home, of changing their routes at night, of clutching keys in their hands as improvised weapons. Claire's name became a cautionary tale. She had done everything right. She walked a short, familiar route home. She lived in what was considered a safe neighborhood. And still, she was killed. Safety apps saw an increase in downloads. Pepper spray sold out in local stores. The fear was not temporary. It lingered, reshaping how people thought about moving through the city. Amid this wave of anxiety, rumors began to swirl. Some speculated about a serial attacker targeting women. Others whispered that the killer was someone inside the building. A few even suggested that the police knew more than they were admitting. The absence of answers left space for imagination to run wild, and in that vacuum the fear only grew. For detectives working the case, the public attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept pressure on the department to prioritize Claire's murder. On the other, it created constant noise that clouded real leads. Tip lines filled with calls, some well-intentioned, others the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. Each had to be logged and checked, consuming hours of manpower while the trail on Claire's actual killer grew colder. Through it all, Sarah and her parents stood at the center of the storm. They attended vigils where candles flickered in the night. Their sister and daughter's name carried on chants for justice. They answered reporters' questions with tired eyes, determined to keep Claire's story alive in a city that never stopped moving. But as weeks turned to months, New York adjusted. The fear softened into habit, and the headlines faded. Claire Donovan's name no longer led the evening news. Her case became one more in a long line of tragedies that New York carried in its memory. For her family, the silence was unbearable. For the city, it was another reminder that closure does not always come. Every unsolved case eventually becomes a puzzle of theories. For investigators, each possibility had to be considered, tested, and either pursued or discarded. In Claire Donovan's murder, the theories multiplied quickly. Each one seemed plausible at first glance, but as evidence failed to support them, detectives were left chasing shadows. The first and most obvious theory was that Claire had known her killer. The lack of forced entry pointed strongly to this. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, and ex-partners were examined again and again. If Claire had let someone inside willingly, it would have been someone she trusted or at least recognized. Yet none of the interviews revealed hostility strong enough to explain murder. Every lead that hinted at familiarity fell apart under scrutiny. A second theory was that she had been the victim of a stalker. In big cities, women are too often followed or harassed by strangers who remain unnoticed until it is too late. Detectives combed through Claire's emails and phone records, searching for messages or repeated calls from unknown numbers. They questioned neighbors about unfamiliar faces lingering near the building. Aside from the vague sighting of a man in a hoodie, nothing concrete tied to stalking emerged. Still, the idea persisted. A stranger who had fixated on Claire, waiting for the right moment, remained one of the more chilling possibilities. Another theory painted the crime as a burglary gone wrong. Perhaps someone had broken into her apartment expecting it to be empty, only to panic when Claire returned home. Yet, this explanation unraveled quickly. Nothing was missing. Her purse, wallet, and electronics were left untouched. A burglar who left valuables behind and managed not to leave fingerprints seemed unlikely. Detectives dismissed this theory as inconsistent with the facts. Some investigators considered the idea of a random intruder, someone who slipped in through an unlocked door or window. New York apartments often carried vulnerabilities, and even a small lapse could prove fatal. Yet Claire's building was secure, with controlled access through the lobby and locked stairwell doors. For a random intruder to bypass those measures without being caught on camera seemed improbable. The darker speculation came from those who believed the killer had hidden inside her apartment before she returned home. It was a disturbing thought, but not impossible. If someone had gained access earlier in the evening, they could have waited silently in the shadows, striking after Claire changed clothes and began preparing her dinner. Detectives searched for evidence of tampering with locks or windows, but found none. The theory remained unsettling but unproven. As months passed, amateur sleuths online began building their own scenarios. Message boards filled with discussions about the hoodie man, the neighbor with a vague alibi, even the possibility of a connection to other unsolved attacks in the city. Some insisted the case bore hallmarks of a professional hit. Others argued it was the work of someone unbalanced who had simply disappeared back into the anonymity of the city. For detectives, the frustration grew with every discarded theory. Each path consumed hours of manpower, only to circle back to the same place. No suspect, no weapon, no motive. The case file thickened with notes, interviews, and timelines. But the central questions remained unanswered. Who killed Claire Donovan, and why? Sarah and her parents clung to the hope that one of these theories would eventually break open the truth. They followed media speculation, sometimes convincing themselves that this time the police were closing in. Each disappointment deepened their grief. Sarah once told a reporter, "Every new theory feels like it brings us closer, but then it collapses. It is like building a house on sand." By the end of the first year, the official investigation had slowed to a crawl. Theories had been exhausted. Dead ends piled up. What had begun as an urgent search for answers was slipping into the realm of uncertainty that defines so many cold cases. And for the Donovan family, one fear became more real with each passing day. The killer had not only escaped justice, they had erased their presence so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. As months turned into years, the case of Claire Donovan began to fade from public memory. The nightly news stopped running updates. Newspapers no longer printed her photo beside bold headlines. In a city where tragedy struck daily, new crimes replaced old ones, and Claire's name slipped further down the list of stories that demanded attention. For the Donovan family, time did not move forward in the same way. Each year was marked by anniversaries, the day Claire died, her birthday, the holidays she should have been there to celebrate. To them, every date carried weight. To the city, those dates passed unnoticed. The police investigation slowed. Detectives were reassigned, priorities shifted, and the task force dedicated to her case was gradually dissolved. The evidence collected in those early weeks was carefully stored in boxes, labeled and archived, waiting for the day someone might revisit them. For the family, this transfer into cold case storage felt like a betrayal. Sarah later said, "It was as if they were packing her away with the evidence, out of sight, out of mind." Leads that had once seemed urgent were revisited and dismissed. The man in the hoodie remained a ghost with no name. The ex-boyfriend, the jealous coworker, the neighbor with a shaky alibi, all had been questioned, cleared, and set aside. Without new evidence, the case reached a standstill. Life moved on for those around Claire, though always with an absence that was hard to name. Friends got married, changed jobs, moved to new cities. Sarah attended these milestones carrying the shadow of her sister's absence. She would smile in photographs but admitted later that she often imagined Claire standing beside her, laughing, sharing in the moments that were no longer possible. For their parents, grief settled into routine. Margaret kept Claire's room preserved as if she might walk back in at any moment. Thomas withdrew more with each passing year, his health beginning to fail under the weight of stress and sorrow. The family's unity, once strong, frayed under the constant strain of unanswered questions. The Donovan family refused to let her memory vanish completely. They organized annual vigils, inviting friends, neighbors, and supporters to light candles in Claire's honor. At these gatherings, stories were told to keep her alive in words, if not in presence. They read her favorite poems, played her favorite music, and prayed for the day justice would come. Yet, as attendance dwindled over time, the family felt the city's attention slipping away. Detectives from the cold case unit occasionally checked in, but their calls grew less frequent. The family heard the same phrases repeated: "We are still reviewing leads," or "We are waiting on new technology." Years passed with little more than vague assurances. By the 5th anniversary, Sarah described her grief as a kind of numbness. "The pain is still there," she said, "but it no longer cuts the same way. It just sits with you like a weight you carry every day." Still, hope lingered. Advances in forensic science offered the possibility of breakthroughs that had not been available in 2011. DNA databases were expanding, and new methods of analysis promised to uncover details from even the smallest samples. Sarah clung to these developments, convinced that one day someone would reopen the box labeled with her sister's name and finally see what others had missed. But until that day came, the passage of time remained the cruelest part of all. It stole not only the chance for new memories but also the urgency that once surrounded the case. Claire Donovan's story risked becoming a footnote, buried in the endless files of New York's unsolved crimes. For her family, silence was never closure. It was a reminder that justice had not been served, and that somewhere, someone carried the knowledge of what happened that night. Time might move forward for the world, but for the Donovans, it was forever September 2011. By the time a decade had passed since Claire Donovan's murder, the case had settled into the archives of the NYPD's cold case files. Dust gathered on the boxes that held her story, but her family never allowed her memory to fade. They continued to push, writing letters to officials, contacting journalists, and keeping her photo alive in the public eye whenever they could. That persistence paid off in 2021, when a new cold case initiative brought Claire's name back into circulation. The NYPD had recently invested in advanced forensic technology. DNA testing, once limited by the quantity and quality of samples, had evolved dramatically. Even the smallest traces of genetic material could now be analyzed in ways that were unthinkable in 2011. Detectives decided to pull Claire's evidence out of storage. hoping that science might finally deliver what interviews and surveillance never could. The items from her apartment were carefully unpacked. Swabs from doorknobs, samples from her clothing, fragments collected from beneath her nails. Everything was retested. Forensic specialists used cutting-edge techniques to search for genetic profiles that had previously gone undetected. When results began to emerge, the Donovan family's hope surged. Detectives announced that they had recovered a partial DNA profile from an object found near Claire's body. It was not a full profile, but it was enough to be entered into national databases. Weeks later, they received confirmation that the profile did not match anyone already in the system. The news was bittersweet. It meant the killer had likely never been arrested or convicted of another crime. Still, it was more than they had before. It was a thread, however thin, that had the potential to unravel the truth. The renewed investigation sparked a wave of media coverage. Headlines once again carried Claire's name. Journalists revisited her story, this time focusing on how technology might succeed where traditional police work had failed. Sarah appeared in interviews, her voice steadier than in earlier years, but her message unchanged. "We are still waiting for justice. We cannot give up." Detectives also revisited the original suspect list with fresh eyes. Ex-boyfriends were contacted again. Former colleagues were tracked down. Neighbors who had moved away were located for follow-up interviews. Many were surprised to hear from police after so many years, but they answered questions once more, some remembering details they had forgotten or suppressed. At the same time, the DNA evidence was uploaded into genealogical databases designed to trace distant relatives. This technique had recently helped solve other notorious cold cases. The possibility that a familial connection could identify Claire's killer gave the Donovan family renewed energy. They began to believe, for the first time in years, that answers were possible. Community members also rallied. Social media accounts dedicated to unsolved crimes began sharing Claire's story again, reaching audiences far beyond New York. Online sleuths built timelines, mapped her final movements, and speculated about the partial DNA. The case found a second life in the digital age, where ordinary citizens amplified the family's plea for justice. Still, the renewed hope was fragile. Detectives cautioned that partial profiles were difficult to work with. Matches could take years, and sometimes they never came at all. The family understood the limitations, but after a decade of silence, even a sliver of progress felt like a breakthrough. For Sarah, the reopening of the case brought back painful memories. She was forced to revisit the night she found her sister, the unanswered questions, the image of Claire's life frozen in time. Yet she embraced the pain if it meant there was a chance at closure. "We do not want sympathy," she said in one interview. "We want the truth. We want accountability." As the investigation pressed forward, detectives knew they faced a race against time. Witnesses' memories faded. Potential suspects had built new lives. Evidence degraded. But technology had given them a reason to believe the case was not over. And for the Donovan family, hope had returned in a way they had not felt in years. Fragile, imperfect, but alive. The renewed investigation into Claire Donovan's murder brought a wave of hope, but hope can be fragile. For a brief moment, it seemed that technology might succeed where witnesses, interviews, and traditional police work had failed. Yet, as months passed, optimism gave way once more to silence. The partial DNA profile recovered from Claire's apartment remained unmatched in national databases. Detectives checked regularly, waiting for a hit, but none came. The genealogical searches promised by forensic specialists dragged on with little progress. Tracing distant relatives through overlapping genetic markers proved complex, time-consuming, and often inconclusive. Each update felt more cautious than the last. For the Donovan family, the anticipation became unbearable. At first, they waited eagerly for every call from investigators, believing that this time the news would be different. As weeks turned into months, those calls grew shorter, their tone less certain. Detectives explained that they were doing everything possible, but the reality was clear. The case was once again slipping into the same shadows it had lived in for nearly a decade. The renewed media coverage that had briefly reignited public interest also began to fade. Online sleuths moved on to other mysteries. Journalists stopped calling. Candlelight vigils grew smaller each year. Sarah, once the voice of the family's fight for justice, admitted that she struggled to keep pushing. "It feels like we are screaming into an empty room," she told one reporter. "Everyone listens for a moment, then they go back to their lives. We cannot go back. We live with this every day." Inside the police department, detectives faced their own frustration. They had invested hundreds of hours re-examining evidence, revisiting interviews, and following new leads generated by online speculation. Each one ended the same way, with no suspect identified and no case built strong enough to pursue charges. One of the most painful realities was the lack of physical evidence. The murder weapon had never been recovered. Without it, forensic testing could only go so far. Investigators theorized it might have been something ordinary, an object carried out of the apartment that blended into the city's endless background. Without the weapon, any case would remain circumstantial at best. The idea that Claire's killer could still be living in New York, passing strangers on crowded sidewalks, perhaps raising a family or working an ordinary job, haunted both detectives and her loved ones. The anonymity of the city, once a comfort, had become a torment. Anyone could be the person who slipped through the cracks that night. For Sarah, the hardest part was the weight of time. 10 years had already passed, and each year without answers felt like another betrayal. She began to wonder if justice was even possible. "Sometimes I think the person who did this will die without ever being named," she said. "And we will be left here, still waiting." The Donovan parents, older now and increasingly frail, carried their grief more quietly. Margaret still kept Claire's belongings preserved, refusing to change her room. Thomas spoke little about the case, but his silence carried the heavy resignation of a man who feared he would not live to see the truth revealed. Despite the setbacks, the case remained officially open. Detectives promised the family that advances in technology might one day bring answers, but promises without progress only deepened the family's despair. Each time they heard the words, "We are still working on it," they wondered if that meant anything at all. The shadows around Claire's murder had thickened once more. Theories remained theories. Evidence remained thin. And the killer who had walked out of her apartment that night remained invisible. In New York, life moved forward with its endless rhythm of noise and motion. But for the Donovan family, the city's hum only amplified the silence where Claire's voice should have been. More than a decade has passed since the night Claire Donovan was killed, yet her case remains unsolved. The police files are thick with reports, interviews, and timelines, but none of it has delivered the answer her family has been searching for. The investigation has become a record of frustration, a catalogue of leads that went nowhere, and a reminder of how fragile justice can be. For the Donovan family, the years have carved deep lines of grief. Margaret still speaks about her daughter in the present tense, as if saying "was" would make the loss too final. Thomas carries his sorrow in silence, retreating from conversations that circle back to Claire's name. Sarah continues to push, though even her voice has grown weary. "We are not asking for miracles," she said in a recent interview. "We are asking for the truth, We are asking for someone to be accountable. The city of New York has moved on, as cities always do. New crimes, new tragedies, new headlines have buried Claire's story beneath layers of time. But for those who knew her, the absence remains constant. Friends still remember her laughter, her love of books, her habit of staying up late to write. They remember the ordinary details that never made it into the police reports, the fragments of life stolen without explanation. Investigators admit privately that the case may never be solved. Advances in DNA technology have helped unlock other cold cases, but Claire's evidence has not yielded a clear match. Without the weapon, without fingerprints, without new witnesses, the trail grows colder with each passing year. The possibility that her killer will never be named is no longer speculation. It is the reality the family must face. Yet the Donovans refuse to let Claire vanish into silence. They continue to organize vigils, to speak her name in public, to remind the world that behind every statistic there is a person, a story, and a family left behind. Their fight is not only for Claire but for every unsolved case that lingers in the shadows of this city. Justice has not come. Closure remains out of reach. And somewhere, perhaps walking through the crowded streets of New York, the person responsible for Claire Donovan's death is still free. This was the story of Claire Donovan, a young woman whose life ended in her own apartment on a quiet night in New York. Her case remains unsolved. If you know something, say something. If you carry a secret, it is not too late to come forward. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like Claire's, where silence lasts for years but truth is never forgotten.